Imagine a world where time isn't just a concept. It's a tangible currency. People trade it, hoard it, and sometimes even fake it. Knowing that every single second counts, in the most literal of cases. Every minute you spend is a choice, whether it's paying for a meal, buying luxury, or even staying alive. Much like our own reality. But in this one, time governs everything. Your work, your relationships, your survival. Through physical means, through physical value as well. The rich thrive, living lifetimes beyond comprehension, while the poor fight desperately for a few more hours, watching the numbers on their wrists tick down like a constant, looming reminder of their mortality. In this world, time isn't just money, it's life. It was Charles Darwin who had once said, "A man who dares to waste 1 hour of time had not discovered the value of life." Previously, we discussed how the financial value that is given to human life is usually a fairly subjective question, whose answers depend on the circumstance of the person in question. That those who place a higher amount to pay for their own resurrection usually come in at a form of higher and greater sets of expectations, gratification, or amount of presets that they have in their life, in contrast to a lower amount for a less impactful life that is lived in. That is, of course, in its most basic level. But that example is something that, for as concentrated as the concept of digital currency could take, even through the more metaphorical and conceptual creation of its own worth, which now brings us to the asked question, one that actually provides a more broad approach to understanding the human mind. How much time are you willing to give for yourself? Time, as we see it, works in a manner that is, at its most simplest form, not that the present allows us to perceive it, considering its entire moment is so small we barely notice it before moving on to the future once again, something that is more linear within our everyday lives, before it becomes the past once more. From a philosophical standpoint, this aligns with the ideas from thinkers like St. Augustine, who questioned whether the present is even measurable since it disappears as soon as it arrives. In physics, particularly with relativity, time is not an absolute entity, further emphasizing how our experience of it is tied to perception rather than any intrinsic static quality. We consider the present is more of an illusion shaped by how we experience constant motion between the past and the future. Yet time is still a conceptual manner of thinking about our lives, these things we call seconds, minutes, hours, years, that, similar to credits, hold simply numerical value. If a transit between your home and your job or school was, let's say, 14 miles in length, that around is 2 hours and 34 minutes of walking, which is 154 minutes in total. Now, to say that the distance between us and, say, the moon is 238,900 miles wide, that number by itself already serves a large degree of scale, giving you a 26-year walk. Now, what about the distance between us and the sun? 92.645 million miles, or just about 377 years of pure walking. See, we as a society hold that each value holds some level of importance to the way we perceive the entirety of our day-to-day lives. That the words million, centuries, and millennia, for example, are mere representations of higher numbers. That all the time could be measured by placing a number in front of it, like 377. A number that alone perhaps doesn't mean much, but bring it to something that is more able to be perceived as an experienced event, and is translated into something more massive. 377 years equals approximately 137,000 days, and 3 million hours, and 198 million minutes. The number continuously increases until it becomes completely unable to be withheld within the human mind and the perception of how we experience it at all points in the day. And see, the number is consistently increasing again and again to the point of becoming essentially far too large to potentially express, to the point of becoming folded on itself once again, reconstructing itself into that of light speed playing speed, and even other forms like quantum fog and even shakes. There are other humorous examples of how we ourselves measure time, but still, returning back to a more personalized manner, time is a facet of our lives that we consistently experience, whether or not we are aware of it, and so it becomes a fascinating and important value that we interpret as a structural integrity to the entire universe and our whole existence. It remains as a manner of thinking, a thought, a concept, not physical. Created by Christopher Lee, TimeOut is a dystopian indie game where time is treated as a literal finite currency. Set in a world where people's remaining lifespans are displayed above their heads, every aspect of daily life revolves around buying, selling, and spending time. People can earn more time through work, trade, or gambling, and every transaction, whether buying a meal or paying rent, costs precious minutes, hours, or even years. If your time runs out, you die instantly. You play as some Detective Sherwood who is tasked with finding out what's happening in the city, with a corrupt CEO-like figure and people selling fake time. It's a short experience, no more than 20 minutes, but it still gets the situation across fairly well. Is the gratification that a person has about their life enough to sway the opinion of whether or not they would give time away to another person? Time, one could argue, is even more valuable than currency if given a physical form. For the sake of brevity, let's make a composition of both fictional and theoretical frames of reference. We'll be referring to this concept of physical time as temporal risk value theory, or TRVT, a psychological framework that merges prospect theory with the mechanics of time as a currency, seen in games like TimeOut. Let's propose that individuals evaluate decisions not only in terms of potential monetary or material gains and losses, but by also factoring in the perceived value and risk associated with time as a finite personal resource. TRVT examines how people behave when time is treated as a tangible asset that can be spent, saved, or lost, and how that perception of influences decision-making, risk tolerance, and emotional responses. People do have a subjective sense of value of time, similar to how they perceive the value of money. The more finite or scarce the material feels, the more precious it becomes. For example, when time is presented as a currency that can be directly spent or lost, individuals may value it differently based on urgency or life circumstances. Yet people tend to overweight the short-term value of time, acting more impulsively or seeking immediate gratification when time feels limited, but underweight long-term time risks, failing to see how small losses in time accumulate. This will and does in turn propose three distinct ideas. One, that people might prioritize immediate, low-risk actions to conserve their time, since the cost of failure is not just virtual currency, but the actual loss of life. Riskier choices, even with higher potential rewards, becoming less appealing as the perceived cost of time rises. And as a third point, while people get closer to running out of time, they may exhibit irrational risk aversion as the perceived value of time increases dramatically. The Quantum Thief by Hannu Rajaniemi is a sci-fi novel set in a future where advanced technology allows people to manipulate their memories, privacy, and even their lifespans. In the society of Ublet, a Martian city, time is used as currency, with citizens paying for goods and services using their lifespan. The more time one has, the more social privileges and physical survival they can maintain. The protagonist, Jean Laflambeau, is a master thief who is freed from a mind prison to retrieve his lost memories and engage in a heist across multiple, intricately designed timelines. In Rajaniemi's novel, time is viewed as a finite and precious commodity, which makes decisions far more impactful. The diminishing utility of time comes into play as characters must weigh how much time they are willing to lose in exchange for privileges or goods. The longer people live, the more protective they become of their remaining time, embodying the principles of temporal risk value theory by becoming more cautious in decisions that could result in lifespan loss. As the genre moves through different heists, he exemplifies how individuals balance the value of time, risk, and potential rewards in a time-dependent society. In an additional case, In Time is a dystopian sci-fi film where time has been replaced as the primary currency. Everyone stops aging at 25, but they are only given 1 year of life to live unless they can earn more. Time is literally on their wrist, ticking down with every transaction, and the rich can live forever while the poor struggle daily to survive. The protagonist, Will Salas, comes from the ghetto, where people die every day because they run out of time. After gaining a large sum of time, Will fights against a system that forces the poor to die while the wealthy hoard centuries. The movie embodies the core principles of TRVT by directly commodifying time, turning it into an explicit resource that governs every choice and behavior. The poor are more risk-averse as their time is finite and constantly diminishing, while the rich, who have near infinite time, are more reckless and detached from short-term risks, demonstrating how the endowment effect influences decision-making when time is plentiful. The film's depiction of time as a finite spendable currency mirrors how people weigh time-risk trade-offs in scenarios where their lifespan is directly at stake. Will's revolution against the system here illustrates how risk and reward perceptions shift when someone gains time, challenging the risk and changing the way time is valued. Maybe this is all just a pointless endeavor then, to give life a deeper meaning, to think that in solidifying time as a currency, as something to hold, that the gratification could increase for your own life. But in these three different societies, that's never the case. That just as money brings you back from the dead, it all becomes another way to control, to create a divide between the living and the dead, that everything, one way or another, is pointless. But it's not. In a study by Batson et al. In 1981, participants were asked to help one another after witnessing another individual in distress, and the willingness to give time was influenced by their level of empathy. One key finding was that individuals were more likely to give time to help someone if they felt empathy for them. In one variation, participants could help one another by taking their place in a task, thus giving their time, and those who felt empathetic were more likely to volunteer. The findings were as follows. Participants who felt high empathy towards the person in distress were willing to take over a 70% longer task on average compared to the control group with low empathy. High empathy participants were willing to spend around 90% more time helping than those who experienced low empathy or indifference. And the likelihood of volunteering to give time, taking over a task, was twice as high when empathy was induced compared to the neutral or low empathetic groups. Temporal discounting, perceived in the study, shows us that the immediate value of time, such as helping someone in need, is often weighed more heavily than future gains. But if the cost of losing that time in the future is considered too high, people may choose not to give their time at all, even if the present emotional or altruistic rewards are strong. This interplay between immediate and future value is crucial in understanding how time is perceived as a risky resource. In Batson's experiment, empathy significantly increased the perceived value of time given to help others. High empathy participants saw their time as being more valuable, essentially, when used to help someone they empathized with, which aligns with TRVT's idea that people assign different subjective values to their time. In this case, empathy skewed the value of perception of time towards altruistic giving. Participants didn't seem to weigh the future costs of their life loss heavily, especially in the high empathy group. Their immediate emotional response overpowered long-term time commitments and considerations. This structure of perceiving time, whether physical or conceptual, leads into three main propositions. First is that if time were literal currency, how would that change your priorities? People prioritize short-term satisfaction over long-term goals in a world where time is traded, leading to a cultural shift that emphasizes immediate pleasures and quick results rather than delayed gratification or future planning. This change could diminish investment in relationships, personal growth, and even health as people seek to maximize their time wealth in the present moment. Second proposition asks, does the way we spend our time reflect what we truly value, or is it driven by societal expectations and norms? Well, the way that we value time is less a reflection of personal values and more a result of societal pressures and economic systems. In any case, in any society that we just realized and I talked about today, because they dictate how we allocate our time towards work, obligations, and productivity. In this sense, time may already be treated as a currency in a metaphorical sense, dictated by external forces rather than individual choice. The idea that time isn't fully ours to control is exemplified in modernized capitalistic societies, where economic necessity forces are placed upon individuals to spend their time on work and productivity rather than personal fulfillment. In the game TimeOut, this idea is pushed to the extreme, where characters are literally charged for every second they spent, mirroring how people today may feel about wasting time at work or on tasks that don't align with their personal values. Psychological concepts like social comparison theory and status anxiety play a role here, as many people may allocate time based on how they perceive others are spending it, driven by competition or even societal expectations. Which brings us to this final proposition question, and one that relates back to the initial point, which is how much is your life worth? Though in this case we will rearrange it in a more proper setting. How much is human time worth to society in an external force? Because taking all of this into account, it would make more sense that the answer to this question would almost include an exact answer comparison to that of our previous engagement, where those with a higher gratification would be given more time. Although creating an empathetic perspective in this situation, it feels more obvious and sensical to imagine that those in the HG, or high gratification grouping, would spend less time in the situation, contrasting those in the LG, or low gratification group, where that value would increase with more riskier spending until, well, they eventually disappear. Despite all of this, there is still one final value to address, even if answering the question. Another conceptual means of measurement, this state of empathy itself, one which we will discuss in the final video of this trilogy, but keep it in mind for now. Worth, like empathy, is subjective to the individual and or corporation, although it can still be implemented at a harsher degree based on production, which is unfortunately becoming the case in today's world, where age requirements for jobs or lowering along with wages has a normality and commonality within our own society in a modernized world. In this type of society itself, TRVT would serve as the framework for maintaining peace by balancing the value of time with the risks people are willing to take. A formula for it could even be as standard as TRVT equals the perceived time value minus the risk of lost time to societal factor. This formula, while more categorical than quantitative, indicates that individuals weigh the value of their time against the risk of losing it, while societal structures like laws or norms mitigate or exacerbate those entire risks. To ensure peace, society would then have to establish fair systems for time allocation, including limiting the exploitation of vulnerable groups like children. In such a world, child labor would be seen as a violation of these principles, as children who lack the full understanding of time's values would be exploited and coerced into trading their time for immediate survival rather than future growth. Laws would need to protect all children from having their time unfairly taxed or manipulated, ensuring that all citizens can live without constantly risking the depletion of their time reserves for survival. In this model, peace is achieved through regulations that create a minimum time buffer for all, reducing inequality and minimizing the reckless behavior that arises from desperation. Though this is all, of course, metaphorical and hypothetical in nature, this formula wouldn't necessarily really impact that much of the lives of people because of the fact that it is more so a suggestion for others as well. Though even so, it does not mitigate the fact that this is still something that could occur in the future where money and currency and any value that we have for any resource in our lives could always be exposed or exploited one way or another. I suppose that means child labor would be just another fashion of piggy banks for higher-ups in some degree. In societies where time becomes an even more literal currency, like in the game TimeOut or films like In Time, these dynamics become even more pronounced. Whether time is seen as a gift, a burden, or a commodity, our relationship with it shapes how we connect with others, make decisions, and ultimately, how we live our lives. Time, at the end of the day, is a subjective quality, physical or otherwise, something whose value is even more disjointed and disordered than even the old bartering system of the olden days, but has a fundamental difference between any variation of currency, and that is its permanence within the system of things. That every single value we have in our lives is capable because of time. And we live in a world that is ever-changing, having reached the threshold of over 8 billion people on this planet. And whether in nanoseconds, light years, or even the impossibly paradoxical time that is the present, I, for one, hope that it's spent in all the right ways.